Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this not quite winter afternoon for our penultimate Washington History Seminar of this season. My name is Eric Arneson. I'm from George Washington University. I'm the co-chair of the seminar, along with Christian Osterman, the other co-chair. For those of you who are new, and to repeat for those of you who have been here before, this seminar is a joint effort on the part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. Behind the scenes, Amanda Perry and Pete Bierstecker work very hard to pull the logistics off week after week. We very much appreciate their efforts. The seminar also relies upon the generosity of institutions and individuals, and the Department of History at George Washington University is one of those institutional sponsors, and there are many anonymous donors. And this time of year, though you probably heard me say this many times before, we invite you to join the ranks of donors, anonymous or not anonymous, particularly before the end of the tax year. We have one more session, as I've hinted, next week on December 10th, when Sarah Snyder and Nicholas Badalasi speak on their new book, The CSCE. Yes, thank you. And the End of the Cold War, Diplomacy, Society, and Human Rights, 1972 to 1990. I have been notified by Pete, who lets nothing pass, that I am in error on the penultimate. And so if there's a word for two more ahead, then I stand corrected because we have another session on December 7th. My apologies for that error. And with that, what did I say? 17th. I'm on a roll today, and it's not because of the subject of the book or what I might have done before this seminar. The 17th. All right, focus. And so with that, before I make even more errors, I'm turning this over to Christian, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Eric. As always, great to see some familiar and some new faces in the audience here. Just want to underline what Eric said in terms of your contributions, especially if you're regular to this seminar. If you're not, we hope you will become one. Now's the time to support the National History Center and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program, the two organizations co-organizing the seminar. These contributions are tax-free, so you'll get some note from us that you can deduct this amount from your taxes if you give. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Emily Dufton to the seminar. Emily received her PhD in American Studies from George Washington University. She's the author of Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America, published last year by Basic Books, and of course the subject of today's talk, a book that traces the effects of grassroots activism over 50 years of shifting state and federal cannabis laws. She's a writer, historian, adjunct professor, and co-owner of Tacoma Writers, a speechwriting and ghostwriting workshop for officials in Washington, D.C. and beyond. And even though I'm not an official, this sounds really good. I have to keep this in mind for future occasions. We're delighted to have you here and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Drs. Osterman and Arneson for having me. It's really an honor, and thank you very much to Amanda Perry and Peter for doing all the logistics for getting me here. I'm really very honored to be here, and I hope you find this material interesting. I certainly do, and I've spent 8 years doing it now, so it just gets better. Before I begin, though, I'd like to mention that early last week, Leo Rebuffo died. It's still hard for me to talk about. The book that I wrote and the dissertation it was based on would not have been possible without this man and the many times he called me out on my BS throughout the writing process. I even dedicated Grassroots to him. So I just want to take a moment to honor his memory. We really lost an intellectual giant last week, and I can't quite believe it's real. So thank you so much for taking a moment to recognize him. Before we begin, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself as well. As the moderator said, I received my PhD from GW in 2014. Currently, I'm an author and a historian. I adjunct at Montgomery College, and I'm working on my second book, in addition to ghostwriting, which is going to be about the history of medically assisted treatment for opioid use disorders, which is just as corrupt and horrible as the building of the opioid overdose crisis today. So look for that depressing one, hopefully in a year or two. When I arrived at GW, I wanted to study a couple of different things, particularly the history of grassroots social activism. And I wanted to study this for multiple reasons. I wanted to know why some grassroots activists were incredibly influential and why others weren't. And I remember one of the earlier times I came back to DC, which was 15 years ago, during another strange anniversary, which was when we invaded Iraq for the Iraq War. I was an undergrad at NYU at the time, and I took a bus down with some friends, and we marched on the mall amongst people with tie-dye t-shirts and drum circles, and I thought, wow, this didn't work 40 years ago. I don't think it's going to work today. And it didn't. We're still in Iraq. And I was fascinated by that. Why was some social activism influential, and why were others not? What made a real impact and why? I had also been interested in drug history for a number of years, ever since I read a book called Can't Find My Way Home by Martin Torgoff. I really loved his book, and I loved his perspective, because he suggested that through the use of taboo substances like drugs, we could explore some really exciting things about American culture, like underground art and literature and protest, political protest and cultural rebellion, and psychological experimentation, the idea of tapping into greater powers of the mind. Torgoff didn't only write about drug users, though. In one small section, he also wrote a little bit about anti-drug activists. He mentioned that there was this movement in the 1970s, led by parents, who protested adolescent marijuana use. But he was very quick to kind of brush them off and say, you know, what a bunch of like downers, right? Like, these parents were totally lame, who cares about them? So when I got to grad school and I was tasked with writing my dissertation, I really wanted to add to this conversation. I wanted to combine history with the studies of social activism, and I thought that looking closer at what Torgoff didn't would be a good place to start. So I did. My dissertation was the history of the parent movement itself, which I argued was one of the most powerful waves of anti-drug activism in American history, since Carrie Nation led the fight for alcohol prohibition. But the parent movement was only part of the story. After I graduated, I knew I wanted to expand my dissertation into a book, because I wanted to tell the whole story. I knew from my research that the parent movement did not form in a vacuum. It formed in response to widespread pro-marijuana, pro-decriminalization activism in the 1960s. And the parent movement itself then in turn launched a reinvigorated movement for legalization in the 1980s, 90s, and now into the 2000s. In fact, the more that I researched, the more I realized that almost all state and federal changes to cannabis laws were enacted precisely because of the work of tens of thousands of grassroots activists over the past 50 years. We often associate major changes in drug policy with politicians and presidents and first ladies and these important people. But when it comes to cannabis, for the past half century, the people at the center of every legislative change have been regular Americans who had committed themselves to the fight, oftentimes turning it into their careers. And that's what makes marijuana history so interesting to me, because it's the story of us. So this is my book, Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America. It was released almost exactly 1 year ago on December 5th, 2017. And then, not to be outdone, my 1-year-old son started walking the next day, as if to say, like, yeah, good job, Mom, look what I can do. And it's gotten a pretty good response. So the reason I wanted to write this book was because I love this story, and I love the people in it. I loved how passionate they were and how a lot of them still are. Many of them are still alive, and I conducted over 24 interviews for it. And I loved that it showed that the reason America's marijuana laws have changed over and over and over again is because of the work of waves of vocal, committed activists. And I felt their history ought to be known. So we should talk maybe a little bit about where we are today before we go into the history, and where the work of this half century of activism has gotten us. Currently, after the 2018 midterm elections, recreational adult use legalization is available in 10 states and Washington, D.C., and medical marijuana is legal in 30 states and Washington, D.C. I've had to update this map many times since starting this PowerPoint. People think that this is the new normal, right? That the tide has turned and that marijuana prohibition will inevitably fail. And that's, I think, where the utility of my history comes in, because maybe this will happen. Maybe the tide has turned, but maybe it won't. And why am I unconvinced? Because history tells a very different story. We were in a similar position 30 years ago, about 30 years ago, in 1980, when decriminalization had passed in a dozen states and people were sure of marijuana's inevitable legality. No one expected the Just Say No era of the later 1980s to be lurking around the corner, waiting to recriminalize marijuana nationwide. And few expected laws from the Just Say No 1980s would be overturned again by a growing coalition of gay rights and social justice activists who have pushed for greater access to cannabis from the 1980s to today. That suggests that the pendulum of public opinion on marijuana just keeps swinging back and forth from acceptance to criminalization over and over again, even when it seems like it's come to a rest. So that's the topic of today's talk, this 50-year history of marijuana activism that will prove that pot is one of the country's most unique substances because it has the distinct ability to move back and forth between legality and illegality over and over again. And it's happened almost entirely because of grassroots activists. So let's hear about them, shall we? Meet the man responsible for launching the legalization movement. His name is Lowell Eggemeier. On August 16, 1964, Lowell Eggemeier was 28 years old. He walked into the San Francisco Hall of Justice and decided he wanted to start a campaign to legalize marijuana smoking. So he goes to the police officers, lights up a joint, declares his intentions, and is immediately arrested. Marijuana's legal status in the United States is very mixed in 1964. There's no federal law against pot except for the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which does not criminalize it specifically, but does a couple of other things. In short, though, the federal government's official stance hadn't changed much since the reefer madness era of the 1936 film, in which they basically suggested that marijuana use would make individuals go crazy. They would commit suicide or murder or even worse, miscegenation. That was the big fear. You would immediately get addicted to heroin, horrible things would follow, et cetera, et cetera. But there were state laws against the drug, similar to today, and they varied quite widely. In some states that have always been fairly sympathetic to the drug, like Oregon, not so bad. But surprisingly, in California in 1964, marijuana use and possession was a felony. And Eggemeier was incarcerated for a year for his act. He's also not necessarily the person you would expect to launch the legalization movement. He has short hair, he has a fairly well-kept beard, he's just wearing a t-shirt and hanging out with his dogs. These photos are from slightly later in the 1970s. They're ones he actually sent to me. But again, he's not the idea of the hippie. And again, keep in mind that 1964 is a year before those hordes of sandal and bead-clad hippies descend upon the Haight-Ashbury. It's 3 years before the Summer of Love. Eggemeier is very avant-garde for his time. And and is, I think, a really interesting sort of, he's been too long a side note to the history of cannabis legalization, so I'm trying to bring him back. Eggemeier gets a lawyer as he has been incarcerated, and the person he chooses has so much to do with the history of legalization. He's a fascinating individual. His name is James R. White III, who is a libertarian who described himself as to the right of Barry Goldwater. It was kind of intense. He was interested in Eggemeier's case because to him it was an issue of personal freedom. As a libertarian, he was very opposed to the idea that the government could tell an individual what they could or could not do, especially in a case where he perceived that the individual was creating no social harm. So he actually defends Lowell Eggemeier pro bono as well. White's a researcher after our own hearts, and to defend Eggemeier, he digs into old government reports that contradict the federal government's current reefer madness state. He finds, for example, the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1894, the Panama Canal Zone Commission of 1925, the LaGuardia Report of, I think, 1945. And all of these reports show that the federal government stated that marijuana was both less toxic and less habit-forming than either alcohol or tobacco. So by showing that the federal government once felt this way, White argued that modern laws against cannabis were unconstitutional and that his client didn't deserve to be jailed for its use. Now again, he's defending Eggemeier pro bono, and he kind of needs some money. So he starts printing his findings in these mimeographed, hand-illustrated pamphlets he calls marijuana puffin. You can see them over there on the left. So you can see the LaGuardia report. There's something about peyote. I love like the hand illustrations. And they're circulating widely among these proto-hippies in the San Francisco area. He also starts a group called LEMAR, which is a contraction of legalized marijuana. And LEMAR rallies joined with groups like the Grateful Dead and the Charlatans. You can see the poster there underneath, Help End Marijuana Prohibition, to come and play music, rally for legalization, and spread the gospel of the government's unfair punishment of the drug. The first one takes place a couple of months after Eggemeier's arrest in December '64. And one individual who happened to be in San Francisco at the time doing a year-long residency at Berkeley was the poet featured in the middle there. Anyone know who that is? Ginsberg, that's right. So he's walking through Union Square in San Francisco, sees this rally and says, I can't believe it. I have been preaching this for years. Now there's a group here. This is fascinating. He leaves San Francisco at the end of that month, but by January '65, he's back in New York, starts a LEMAR group at the East Village Bookshop, the City Eye Bookshop, and that is a photo of him, I think on January 9th or 10th, 1965, at a rally in front of the Women's Detention Center, where a couple of LEMAR activists had been arrested. And he wears his little placard that says, quite simply, pot is fun, and he has his cup of coffee. He's photographed by a photographer from the Village Voice, and the image, as they said, goes around the world. So now LEMAR has its mission, it has its platform, it has an East Coast base, and it has a celebrity. It's really starting to come together. And together they all say that they believe that smoking pot should be legal, not only because of the sense of individual rights, but also because of a growing connection to the counterculture of the time. Questioning marijuana's legal state aligned with the other growing social concerns of the time quite perfectly. White was pointing out in his reports that the government could lie. It was either lying in 1894 when the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission said that marijuana was less toxic than alcohol or tobacco, or it was lying now when it was backtracking on these suggestions. And the sense that the government was lying was permeating other realms at the time, too. Young people started questioning if the government was lying when it said that segregation was necessary, or that we were winning the Vietnam War. This questioning of the government's official stance fueled growing social dissent, and it swept legalization up in the same movement that launched enormous anti-war marches and civil rights demonstrations. It was a moment of real historical kismet. And I should also note that although Lowell Eggemeier launched the first legalization campaign, He didn't stick with it, right? He left the movement as soon as he was released from jail, and I only found him because there was only one Lowell Eggemeier in the United States, and he was on whitepages.com. So whenever I give like advice to young historians, I'm always like, find people with unique names to research. It's so much easier to track them down. He was very opposed to also sort of being included because he didn't get married until quite a bit later in life, I think when he was in his 50s, and his wife is just furious that he launched the legalization campaign. So he'd only communicate with me on text message. He sent me a lot of emojis, but those are the photos I got from him. So thank you, Lowell Eggemeier. So Richard Nixon is elected president shortly after Lowell Eggemeier is released from jail. And he realizes the threat that this growing counterculture poses to his law and order administration. He wants to stop the rallies that are taking place down the street on the National Mall, but he knows he can't arrest people for protesting. That's the First Amendment. But he can do something else. He can target these people in a different way, and that's by going after what appears to be their drug of choice, marijuana. In fact, pot could warrant a pretty serious offense if he could get Congress to pass a new law. So that's what he does. Nixon and his Attorney General, John Mitchell, who's there all the way on the right holding the papers, I think he looks like Alfred Hitchcock, they lobby very hard to pass the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which you may recognize for the 5 schedules in which it places illicit and illicit drugs. In a descending order from Schedules 1 to 5, drugs are ranked on their potential for abuse and their medical value. Schedule 1, which you can see right there, they have no established medical usage, cannot be used safely, and they have great potential for abuse. So you see heroin, you see LSD, mescaline, peyote, psilocybin, and marijuana. Then it goes down to Schedules 2, which has cocaine, methadone, things like that, and then all the way down to Schedule 5, which is Robitussin, over-the-counter drugs, things like that. Nixon worked incredibly hard to convince Congress to put marijuana in Schedule 1, and he was able to get it there by suggesting that this placement would be temporary, pending the results of an investigation the Controlled Substances Act also set up, which was called the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, nicknamed the Shafer Commission after its leader, Raymond Shafer, who was the former Republican governor of my home state of Pennsylvania. The Shafer Commission, which is seen right there, was a 13-member committee tasked with conducting a 2-year investigation that would study the scope and depth of the nation's marijuana use. Nixon naturally hoped that they would find awful things about the drug that would justify its Schedule 1 placement and benefit his criminalization of it. He hoped they would link it to violence, harder drug use, bad grades, the generally declining moral state of the nation, things like that. He even strong-arms Shafer several times, trying to ensure he gets the results that he wants, because once the commission was over, Shafer was hoping for a federal judgeship, and Nixon basically said, you can have that if you give me what I want. So you can see the picture of the commission here. That's Shafer in the middle handing the report to Nixon. And if you notice, one of those individuals is not like the other. There is one female member on the Shafer Commission. Her name is Joan Gans Cooney. On the off chance, does anyone know who Joan Gans Cooney is? Only one group I've ever given this lecture to has known. I'm so proud of her. Did anyone here watch or had a child who watched Sesame Street growing up? They learned how to count with the count. Big Bird taught them how to be kind. You have that woman to thank. She was the first executive producer of the Children's Television Workshop. She is responsible for getting Jim Henson and Sesame Street on the air. She is fascinating. She's still alive. I spoke to her in February of this year. Like, the list of her accomplishments is as long as this table, and she's like, oh yeah, I did that pot thing too. It's like, yeah, you did that pot thing too. The reason she was on this is because, as she puts it, she was a twofer. She was a woman and she was a Democrat. So checking both boxes, that's why she was there. Completely fascinating individual. So Nixon made it very clear what he wanted from the report. But things did not work out that way, not only because of Joan Gans Cooney, but because everybody basically came to the same conclusions. The Shafer Commission found no connection between marijuana and any of the things Nixon tried to blame pot for. Instead, they found that about 24 million Americans had tried the drug at some point, which was about 11% of the population at the time, and about 12 million were regular smokers, so about 5 to 6%. They also found that marijuana smokers were basically no different than the average American. They were no more violent or lazy or anything like that. Ultimately, members argued that laws against marijuana were unfair since they hurt otherwise law-abiding citizens, especially young people, and they did more harm than good by making youth distrustful of national leaders and the police. You also have to keep in mind the time that they're writing this, right? The book is released in 1972, and pot laws were criminalizing a problem that, on the scale of things, Vietnam, Watergate, etc., seemed fairly minimal. The Shafer Commission concludes by arguing very strongly for decriminalization, not legalization, but decriminalization. And they released their findings nationwide in this paperback edition, which, if you can see on the very top, cost $1.25, and sort of spread the Shafer Commission's findings nationwide. So you're probably asking yourself right now, but Emily, marijuana remains a Schedule I drug. If Nixon said its placement there was temporary, pending the results of the Shafer Commission, so recommended decriminalization, what happened? Well, Nixon happened. So Nixon's response to the Shafer Commission's report was essentially to either ignore it completely or denigrate it whenever possible. He downplayed the results to the press. He refused to nominate Shafer for the federal judgeship that he wanted, and he kept marijuana exactly where it was. You can see his reaction in this editorial cartoon that I found from the Sarasota Herald Tribune on March 30th, 1973, where he's leaning over the Oval Office desk and he's saying, "Don't confuse me with the facts," right? But it's other people. It's this grassroots wave of activists who take the Shafer Commission's findings into their own hands, and they start in the form of lobbying and legislation and bring decriminalization nationwide. So since we're here and we know and love DC, we'll start with the city's long role in the history of marijuana decriminalization. The nation's first pro-marijuana lobbying organization formed in DC in 1970 by Keith Stroup. That's him right there in one of his early offices. He starts NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, from a consumer rights angle. He believed that smokers were consumers, not criminals. He wanted to bring the drug above ground, get into stores where it could be taxed and regulated, where production could have quality control, and where people could access the drug without turning to the black market. This is pretty much the same argument we hear for legalization today, but he was making it in 1970, which is pretty remarkable. And NORML, I should note, is still going strong. Its offices are on H Street Northwest, not far from here. They're like around the corner from Momofuku and Madame Tussauds. And the reason Stroup took this approach is because for 2 years after graduating from Georgetown Law School, he worked on Ralph Nader's National Commission on Product Safety. So he learned about why it was necessary for products to be safe for the consumer, because he was scared of things like I always say Chevy Corvair, and everyone always corrects me because that was not the car that would explode. Which was the one that Nader was opposed to?
Pinto.
Flipped over, that's what it was. It was flipped over. The Pinto would explode. The Pinto would explode. The Corvair would flip. Yes, of course. The 70s. What a time. But basically, what Nader was doing when he was advocating for consumer rights, he would show these horrible photos of things that had happened, cars exploding, flammable clothes lighting on fire, things like that, and saying this is a problem. People need to be told, there need to be certain regulations enforced that will allow people to access safe products. And Stroup builds upon this at the end of the National Commission on Product Safety and says that same idea should be applied to this specific substance. It should be brought above ground and made safe. And this is hugely influential. But Straup's only working on Capitol Hill. He wants to change everything from the top down, from the federal government down. And that doesn't work so well. There's a lot of resistance. But on the state level, it's different. Starting in Oregon in 1973, Oregon's always the leader on these things, and then over the course of the next 5 years, young politicians in a dozen states decriminalized the possession of up to an ounce of marijuana, reclassifying it as a civil fine, about the same as a speeding ticket. Suddenly, a third of the country lives where pot possession is essentially legal, or at least not as much of a threat if you get caught. It's an enormous shift. And the reason Alaska, right over there, gets an asterisk is because that was actually not just a state law change, that was actually a change to the state constitutional amendment, which was rather fascinating. And the reason this happens is because pot use at the time is being painted as something that's fairly sympathetic. When people talked about marijuana use in the early 1970s, the image of the pot smoker was young, usually white, often a college student, an otherwise law-abiding individual, kids and young adults who were going to become productive members of society if we didn't lock them up and ruin their lives. And they were doing it in the privacy of their own homes. They weren't hurting anyone else. So this image and the arguments that are around it are incredibly influential, and they really underscore this wave of marijuana acceptance. So you can see the first state passes in 1973. Everybody kind of waits to see if the sky will fall in 1974. Nothing happens. But then the dam breaks, and there's a wave of decriminalization in 75, and then really in 76 and 77. Can anyone think potentially of what might have happened in 1974 to allow these floodgates to open?
Midterm election? Nixon went away.
I am not a crook. Right.
First,
Mm-hmm.
and then the midterm election brought in
Even more state legislatures. Losing,
the state legislature.
because this is state. Yes, that too. But again, this is all mostly state-based. But losing Nixon in the White House on August 9th, 1974, when he resigned, the floodgates opened because we lost the most virulently anti-marijuana president, essentially of, well, Reagan, George H.W., but at the time, the most virulently anti-marijuana president, right? So when he's out, you can sort of see as soon as he's gone, the national conversation changes. Ford just cannot keep up this battle against pot. He's already under hot water for having pardoned Nixon. Everything else is kind of coming to a head. And in 1976, when Carter and Ford battle it out, Carter is actually the first president to run on a specific, explicitly supportive stance for state decriminalization rights. And in order to keep up the youth vote, Ford essentially says, yeah, I don't think I would overturn it if I had to. So you have in 1976, just 3 years after the first law passes, two presidential candidates who are saying, we approve of what's happening in the states and we won't stop it. It is huge. It is a huge, huge shift. So you can see that, excuse me, by 1977, 1978, decriminalization supporters thought they had won the fight. They had Carter in the White House after 1977. States were passing decriminalization laws in waves. Carter's chief drug advisor, a man named Peter Bourne, was working very closely with Keith Stroup at NORML to suggest that laws against drugs should not be more harmful than the drugs themselves. All of these things were happening, and many people believed that national decriminalization and maybe even legalization were around the corner by 1980 at the latest. But it all grinds to a halt in the late 1970s. And the most important reason why is because the decriminalization movement shoots itself in the foot. So while decriminalization laws are spreading across the country, a new industry is popping up alongside of it, and that's paraphernalia. Sales of pipes, bongs, rolling papers, toys, books, shapers, grinders, hiding places, even paraphernalia-filled Christmas stockings boomed in the late 1970s. By 1977, sales of these legal items that were used to consume a still illegal substance hit $250 million a year, about the equivalent of $1 billion today. So, and of course, remember that in the 1970s, the economy is not awesome, right? 1973 and 1979, there are oil shortages that cost gas lines to snake around the block. Carter introduces the term stagflation into the national lexicon. There's not a lot of booming industries, except for drug paraphernalia. And the reason it does boom is not only because more people are smoking, but because there's this growing national drug culture marketplace, fueled by music, movies, and magazines like High Times. That's actually the first issue right there from the summer of 1974 that sold out so quickly that the publisher, Tom Forsad, had to reprint it like 3 or 4 times. High Times wasn't the only one. Everyone had to get in on the game. There was Stoned, Stone Age, High. like a pun name, think about it. There's a magazine called it. Now, how do magazines make money? Advertisements, right? At least they used to make money that way. These ads are both from old issues of High Times, every issue of which, by the way, is in the Library of Congress, and it's really fun to look at them. So on the left, you can see the Buzz Bee, probably one of my all-time favorites, where you take a hit and puff, puff, pass to your friend and fly high. I mean, all the puns, all the puns. And in the middle, that's Rosie and Herbert saying get high with a friend and for high rolling papers. So what do you think the issue with these ads might be? Frisbees, clowns, kids. That's the biggest problem. Decriminalization doesn't have the same level of regulation and oversight that legalization does, nor does it create its own marketplace system. So these magazines and really all of this paraphernalia were available just about anywhere. They were certainly available in the growing number of head shops, but they were also available in 7-Eleven, record stores, pretty much anywhere that sold other objects. You could buy this stuff. And there were no restrictions on who could purchase it. So the New York Times in 1978 gives $300 to an 11, 12, and 13-year-old kid and says, go out to the city and see what you can buy. They come back with $300 worth of stuff. No one's checking IDs. This is available to anyone. The economy was terrible, and a sale was a sale. Accordingly, rates of adolescent marijuana use also begin to rise. By 1979, when it peaked, 11% of high school seniors reported smoking pot every day, and kids as young as 13 reported that the drug was easy to get. And of course, these are the only kids who are reporting honestly to a national survey, so we can assume that the numbers are probably higher. This is what launches the parent movement. This is what launches the nation's first anti-marijuana counter-revolution. In 1976, the woman right there in red, Marcia, her nickname is Keith, I don't know why, man at Schuhard, discovered that her 13-year-old daughter was smoking pot in her backyard at their birthday party, and she goes straight into activist mode. She gets all the parents in the neighborhood together and sits them down in essentially a second wave feminist consciousness raising group and says, this is a problem. The personal is political. Our kids have access to this drug. They have access to this drug culture. We need to do something about it. So they set down a uniform set of rules. They set a curfew. They ban access to paraphernalia and magazines like High Times, and basically demand that their kids stop smoking pot. And it works. Within a few weeks, her daughter is drug-free again, and Schuhard realizes she's on to something. She lives in sort of the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, I should note that. Schuhard is so scared of her daughter's marijuana use because there are some new government reports that she's found that make the drug seem horrifying. It warns that marijuana could make boys grow breasts, it could render young girls infertile, it could destroy generations of chromosomes. I know it's kind of comical today, but, and most problematically, it can encourage amotivational syndrome, a term I'm sure you've also heard, in which kids basically give up on life before it's begun. So by gathering together into what Schuhard calls these parent groups, Schuhard realizes that parents have the power to battle the drug culture that she now saw all around her and give kids the right to live drug-free lives. Her platform goes national incredibly quickly. In 1978, she works with Thomas Gleaton to form PRIDE, the Parents Resource Institute on Drug Education. Oh, that got a little cut off. It says education, at Georgia State University. And in 1979, she publishes that orange book right there called Parents, Peers, and Pot through NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. 1 million copies of Parents, Peers, and Pot are requested through NIDA. It is their best seller. It was free, but it was their best seller of the year and then well into the 1980s. And in it, Schuhard details, this is how you form a parent group, this is why pot is dangerous, all these things. And she focuses on education about the dangers of marijuana because she really wanted to make sure that parents were aware of what was going on. Culture was saying that this drug was basically harmless, in fact comical, and she really worried about that. I should also note that she did not preach prohibition forever. As soon as the kids turned 18, she said, all right, they're adults, they're allowed to do what they want. But while they were in her house, she said parents needed to crack down on this. Shewhart wasn't even the only parent activist in Atlanta. Her neighbor and friend Sue Rushi formed National Families in Action, you can see their logo right there, which focused not on education but on lobbying, particularly lobbying state governments to pass anti-paraphernalia laws. She also published a book about how to form an FIA group, and between Pride and FIA, hundreds and then thousands of parent groups formed across the country, focusing on education and anti-paraphernalia laws. By May of 1980, the parent movement was so strong that they set up their own lobbying group just outside of Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring, called the National Federation of Parents for Drug-Free Youth, or the NFP. So they set up in May of 1980, and it works out quite well that in November of 1980, a certain Ronald Reagan is elected president. Parent activists get an incredibly powerful supporter in the form of Nancy Reagan, who's right there at the NFP's first national conference called Drugs and Youth, an American Crisis, with like the sad down, like the sad stripe of the American flag going down. The thing is, Nancy Reagan needed the parent movement just as much as they needed her. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, Nancy Reagan was incredibly unpopular. A California newspaper called her, and I quote, "a frivolous social climber with more political ambition than Lady Macbeth." Yeah, ouch. So she needed a platform to make her seem more warm and loving and maternal, and the prevention of adolescent marijuana use seems like a good one. Soon, Nancy Reagan is the nation's most prominent anti-drug activist. She spends her husband's 2 terms constantly giving anti-drug speeches, fundraising for parent groups, and even appearing on famous sitcoms like Different Strokes. You can see her there on the bottom, giving her anti-drug spiel. She was by far most famous for becoming the face of Just Say No, which was actually an anti-drug organization formed by an African-American grandmother named Joan Brand in Oakland, California, which Nancy Reagan co-opted, usurped, and whitewashed, ultimately destroying the movement. I don't have the time to tell that whole story today, but it's chapter 10 of my book. I highly recommend reading it. But what's most remarkable is not only that the parent movement went national so fast and got such support, but how well they worked. By 1983, every decriminalization law that had been passed between 1973 and 1978 was overturned, and rates of adolescent marijuana use had plummeted. A majority of high school seniors even reported that they thought smoking pot was incredibly dangerous. So the parents and Nancy Reagan win, right? The battle of marijuana is over. They've won. Let's move on to the next topic. But they don't, because they can't. Nancy Reagan can't leave pot behind because that's her brand by this point. And by this point, parent activists are feeling pretty good about influencing the White House and state and national laws, and they don't want to give up this power. So the battle against adolescent marijuana use continues, and it continues to be played up, even though it's not that necessary anymore. And that's because the national conversation had changed so dramatically. So again, in the 1970s, pot was seemed like a young adult's right to do something in the privacy of their own home. It didn't seem like it was hurting anyone else. They were otherwise law-abiding people. But in the 1980s, an adult's right to smoke pot was superseded by a child's far more important right to grow up drug-free. And because adult drug use had trickled down to kids, all adult drug users were now criminals, and they deserved to be locked up for their drug use. So just a decade after a wave of decriminalization laws made pro-cannabis activists think that legalization was around the corner, marijuana had transformed into the nation's boogeyman. Its use was inimical to good parenting, to good citizenship, to good everything, and pot arrests start to climb from about 400,000 in 1980 to 455,000 in 1982, and then they'll continue to climb over the next 3 decades. Still, despite widespread demonization of pot, marijuana's time as the national drug boogeyman doesn't last forever. In the summer of 1986, a new drug debuts on the national scene, and it knocks marijuana from the headlines. And that is crack. And that is a man who's shutting down all of the streets right now. So crack was a form of smokable cocaine that was cheap, prevalent in America's inner cities, and quickly got painted as an overwhelmingly black, lower-class drug phenomenon. The national crisis about crack began in June of 1986 when the University of Maryland basketball prodigy Len Bias died of a powder cocaine, not crack, but cocaine overdose. And it quickly launched what one New York Times writer described as a destructive sprint across America. Hundreds of news stories decried crack's terrible effects, and there was breathless, increasingly racialized coverage of the drug. So if you thought people were going nuts about pot, just wait till you see what they do about crack. But the interesting thing about crack was that it wasn't scary in the way that the characters on Different Strokes being offered a joint was scary. It was real world, major news headlines, magazine covers, CBS News specials, terrifying. It was so scary that the percentage of Americans, adults calling drugs the nation's most important problem rose from 2% to 13% over the span of 4 months, from April to August 1986, of course bracketing Len Bias's death. Crack was something you couldn't ignore, and it knocked pot right from the headlines. Suddenly, with all these wild stories about crack babies in the news, no one really cared if you smoked a J. But by taking the national focus away from marijuana, crack surprisingly does more for the legalization campaign than almost anything else. By making pot seem tame in comparison, it set the stage for marijuana's resurrection as a new, surprising substance, as a medicine. So the crack crisis is not the only epidemic America is undergoing in the 1980s. Crack hit America just as a wider understanding of the HIV/AIDS epidemic was beginning to emerge. In cities like San Francisco, dozens and then hundreds of young gay men were succumbing to this strange new disease that no one really understood, other than people got really thin, they came down with all kinds of symptoms, and the only people who seemed to be getting it were either gay or injectable drug users. So while crack is dominating headlines and making everybody really scared, thousands of people are dying from this crazy new disease, and nobody respectable wants to get near any of it. But we see something kind of remarkable emerge from this situation, which is that legalization activism joins up with the gay rights movement and births what is essentially the modern medical marijuana movement. So you might recognize the name Robert Randall. He's in the top left there. He was the first person to have the federal government recognize his use of marijuana for legitimate medical reasons, which for him was glaucoma. But Dennis Perron, there in the top right, he's wearing the white shirt and black vest in the middle of his home-based marijuana supermarket called the Big Top. And Brownie Mary Rathbun, there in the center, were the Californians who combined medical marijuana with gay rights to bring to pass the nation's first medical marijuana laws in 1996. Brownie Mary was so named for the brownies that she had been baking since the early 1980s with a special ingredient. She's my favorite person to write about. I really love Brownie Mary. She died in 1999, so I didn't have a chance to talk to her, but she's fascinating. She was divorced, a waitress at an IHOP in the Castro district, and kind of a wild spirit. She'd also been smoking every day since she was 35 because of knee pain. So as I said, she lives in the Castro district, and she really loved all the young men in her neighborhood. The Castro was the developing gayborhood of the time. And she meets up with Dennis Perron and starts baking brownies for his Potts supermarket. I should also note that Dennis just passed away in January of this year, so we lost one of the fathers of medical marijuana in January. So Brownie Mary gets busted, as you do, but because she's this sweet old lady, the judge sentences her to community service, which she does in record time at the Shanti House, which was an organization that treated people with terminal illness. While she's there, she starts meeting all these young men who are dying of this mysterious illness, and she realizes that marijuana can help them. It can give them back an appetite, it can calm their nausea, it can give them a little bit of strength, things like that. So she starts accepting donations of weed, baking about 10 or 20 dozen brownies at a time, and distributing them to her suffering neighbors. So she gets busted again, as you do. But by this point, everybody is really ready to defend this sweet little old lady. She even gets kind of famous. She goes on Maury Povich and the Sally Jesse Raphael show, proclaiming the medical value of marijuana. And who's gonna diss a little old lady, right? Other people in San Francisco have picked up on this idea too, and they've started using marijuana to treat nausea from chemotherapy, glaucoma, a variety of other illnesses. Suddenly, in the wake of crack and HIV, marijuana wasn't the national scourge it was just a few years earlier. It was a medicine, one that could provide relief to a terrifying condition few people understood. So together, Brownie Mary and Dennis Perron pushed for the passage of Prop 215 in 1996, which allowed doctors in California to recommend, not prescribe, but recommend the use of marijuana for patients suffering from any illness. A year later, by 1997, the New York Times reported that nearly a third of Americans knew someone who used marijuana for medical reasons. So marijuana transforms again in just a decade, from a national scourge to a potential panacea, and the drug war begins to change shape in turn. Suddenly, people are less concerned about the victims of drug use and more concerned about the victims of the drug war, at least in terms of this one specific substance. People didn't want to punish someone who's smoking pot because they're battling cancer, and this becomes a very powerful argument, which we can still see today. Medical marijuana has widespread support. In some places, some reports 80 to 90% of Americans support it. 80 to 90% of Americans don't agree on anything. They don't agree on thinking puppies are cute, like nothing, but medical marijuana, it's amazing. So this is not to say, whoops, there we go. This is not to say that marijuana, that people suddenly magically stop getting arrested for pot. Instead, marijuana arrests actually rise. Pot accounted for about 30% of drug arrests in 1990, but by 2002, they arrested for over 50%, even as more medical marijuana laws were being passed. And the numbers keep rising. In 2007, the year marijuana arrests peaked, over 872,000 people were arrested for pot. And by 2010, a marijuana bust occurred nearly every 37 seconds. And the majority of the people getting arrested were African American males, who are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for pot than whites, even though people use the drug at basically the same rates. Michelle Alexander, right there, is a lawyer who was working for the ACLU in California, and she noticed this trend. Her 2010 book, right there, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, detailed the immense negative effects of incarcerating a wider percentage of Black people in America than South Africa had at the height of apartheid. She demanded action on the part of anyone interested in social justice to stop the mass jailing of nonviolent Black male offenders, which she saw as a renewed form of segregation. This is a really important argument, but I do have to note that she never outright suggested that legalization was the answer. She does say that decriminalization can be useful for states struggling with financial problems, and she mentions legalization once. But again, her book isn't a clarion call for this. It's a denunciation of a deeply problematic system. Instead, calls for legalization became the work of a new generation of social justice advocates who were inspired by pot's 20-year history as a medicine and who saw legalization as a chance to do something real and concrete to reduce the number of Black arrests and equalize the playing field for Blacks and whites. In fact, social justice has become the most important argument for legalization yet. Everyone from former right-leaning Republican cops to the lieutenant governor of California, probably the next governor of California, has suggested that legalization is important not just for its financial benefits, but because of the social justice effects it can potentially have. This argument has been so persuasive that it has passed recreational legalization laws in 10 states and DC since 2012, and that means that nearly 70 million people now live where marijuana is legal, and rates of marijuana arrests have plummeted in those states accordingly. So down there, you might see something you recognize if you lived in the city in 2014, which was a poster for DC's legalization campaign. It's right there, right? Legalization ends discrimination is the core message, and it's big. And it's this language, this very political, awoke, deeply sympathetic language that not only pushed legalization efforts to this incredibly powerful level, but it also matches our moment when discussions of social justice and civil rights and white privilege are fairly ubiquitous. So in closing, we have to ask, how's it going? Has it worked? Has legalization changed America? We're now finally an equal country? No, God no, of course not. Marijuana arrests as a whole are down, but Blacks are still more likely to be arrested even in legalized states. And few states have included additional legislation that would expunge someone's prior record. So a marijuana arrest can continue to haunt someone well into the future. All of this is in addition to the fact that it is mostly wealthy white people who own and control larger and larger chunks of the legal industry, which means that white people will continue to profit off a substance that has spent decades incarcerating Blacks. So there are still some issues there. Additionally, the way that legalization laws have passed also pose a problem for today's activists. In every state but Vermont, and potentially New Jersey later on this year or next year, legalization was passed via ballot initiative, which are only available in about half the states. So if you want to pass legalization in places like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, it needs to go through the state legislature, which is a tougher, more convoluted process. And even if a state does pass a ballot initiative, that doesn't mean that the government's going to enforce it. For example, in 2016, Maine voted to legalize, and Governor LePage repeatedly vetoed the bill. So he's suggesting that he wants to make it harder to get questions on ballots. Great response. Finally, Nixon won. Marijuana remains a Schedule I substance, despite some congressional interest in potentially rescheduling it. This makes it really hard for people entering the legal cannabis world to get crop insurance. The wildfires that ravaged Northern California, the ones earlier this year, not the most recent ones, they destroyed millions of dollars worth of crops, which farmers cannot get that money back. The business also functions almost entirely in cash, since most banks are FDIC insured and don't want to lose that insurance by participating in what is still federally a black market. This contradiction is even apparently a rising new wave of anti-marijuana activism. Kevin Sabet with Project SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, is a very vocal critic of this, saying that we're going to repeat our past by continuing to market legal cannabis products to kids. Obviously, Jeff Sessions was very opposed to this, although he's not around anymore. And the pharmaceutical industry is incredibly opposed to legalization, because in states that have medical or recreational, the rates of prescription opioid abuse have dropped precipitously. So Insys Therapeutics, which manufactures fentanyl, which is the cause of most overdose deaths right now, spent $500,000 lobbying against legalization in Arizona in 2016, and that measure didn't pass. So this means that the pendulum might not be done swinging. Pro-legalization activists have a really powerful argument right now, but there's another argument being built on the other side of the coin. And although social justice has generated more support for marijuana legalization than anything else, and it's been 6 years since legalization first hit the market, one more than the brief period of decriminalization, we don't know if it will continue into the foreseeable future. So what will happen next? Unfortunately, I'm a historian, not an oracle. If I were an oracle, I'd make a lot more money. So I can't say for sure, but I know that I'm not surprised by this reaction forming, because it follows in the historical vein. So I want to close on one last big point that is the most important one that I can make. Marijuana is the only drug in the United States that has repeatedly moved back and forth between legalization and criminalization, and it has done so repeatedly. The pendulum of marijuana's approval or disapproval never really stops swinging, and that's because new groups of activists keep rising up to push it in the opposite direction. So don't get too comfortable, because whenever you think the question is settled, it's usually not. After researching this subject for going on a decade, I like to think that pot is like the old saying about the weather. Whenever you think the law on marijuana is final, just wait 5 minutes or 5 years, it'll probably change. Thank you so much. Sorry I went over.
Great, thank you for this very thoughtful and very nicely presented talk. We now open it up to your questions and comments. If you could please wait for the microphone and introduce yourself to our guest speaker so that she knows who she's.
Yes, my name is Richard Coleman. I spent 45 years working for what was called the Bureau of Customs, and it became the Customs Service, and now it's Customs and Border Protection. I was hired in 1971 as part of the effort to, under Nixon, to explain our drug seizures and to take credit for, first it was ounces, and then it was pounds, and then tons, and whatever. At one time, we would actually seize an entire vehicle on the Canadian border for a single marijuana seed. At the same time, the U.S. attorneys were declining anything less than 100 pounds in Southern California. So, and you still have the problem between state laws and federal laws. That's an issue that I don't know who's going to ever resolve that. In terms of things changing, And then, Wall Street Journal says Michigan is now state number 11. So there's another chart to go. As far as the whole concept of where marijuana stands and how it's treated, it was always considered a, quote, gateway drug. It got kids into the idea of being outside the norms and the law. And also just medically, the THC content is altogether different. Marijuana is not marijuana is not marijuana. It's so it's kind of hard to. It's kind of like talking about drugs as a single entity. It's really not. And so anyway, the history, as you say, this is a political issue as much as anything else in science. But the politics of it were ripe, and that's how I ended up in the federal government.
That's fascinating. A lot of the people that I've been talking to for my current book about current book proposal, hopefully it'll be a book, about the opioid crisis, I've been talking to them as well about their thoughts on legalization, on cannabis legalization. And if you're familiar with Mark Kleinman, he's a public policy guy, he's at NYU now, he's written several really good books about drug policy. And he said that the best thing right now would be actually a federal law that does delineate exactly what, like basically outlining what can be allowed within this sort of legal cannabis world, because every state is absolutely different, right? In Arizona, which doesn't have recreational legalization but has medical, you can get a chocolate bar that has 1,000 milligrams of THC in it in one chocolate bar. That's excessive, right? That's excessive. Whereas in California is trying to not kind of repeat the mistakes of the past, and every edible, which is a huge part of the market, is limited to 100 milligrams of THC within each individual product, whatever it is. It also, California is passing laws that some complain are boring. They're not allowed to have cartoons on them. They can't look like a regular Kit Kat bar. They can't be something that a child would, mistakenly consume. So California is kind of at the leading edge on preventing sort of repeating the mistakes of the past, whereas other states are kind of allowing anything to happen. And Kleiman suggested that if we were going to have real control over this to ensure that these incredibly potent products, because you're right, they're far more potent now than they were 40, 50 years ago, to ensure that there would be some sort of control over this, the federal government really does need to stand up and take a role to ensure that there is consistency over an increasing number of states that are really interested in passing these laws, because the money is like irresistible. Will they do that? Beats me. It would be the right thing to do probably, but I don't know if it will.
Right, the gentleman on the left there.
My name is Fred Augustine. I'm a librarian, so I guess you've used our help in your wonderful project.
Thank you for your service.
Is there a parallel movement for industrial hemp and consumable hemp? Mm-hmm. Because I think that's a form of cannabis, but well, now in the supermarket you can buy non-dairy milk made from hemp, and certainly hemp clothing, but it was illegal at one time because of its connection to marijuana. I don't know. Could you please explain that?
That's a great question. Hemp is super interesting, and as the Farm Bill potentially moves closer to passage, it's going to be even more in discussion. Hemp and drug cannabis, however you want it, the pot, right? The devil's lettuce, my preferred term, are the same plant. They are the exact same plant. So because hemp is derived from the cannabis plant, it is also a Schedule I drug. But it is grown and manufactured and sort of used very differently. A hemp product has less than 0.3% THC within it, usually. So you can drink a gallon of cannabis oil and nothing's going to happen except for you drank a gallon of oil, which does not sound super appealing. You will not get high. There is no psychoactive component. And for the most part, hemp products are derived from the stalk of the plant, those strong fibers that are within it. It's grown quite differently to yield greater content of the stalks inside, of the fibers inside. And so that's why it's used for clothing, for, throughout American history is used in sails and the production of cloth and rope and things like that. It's also used for, the seeds are incredibly nutritious. Their oil is incredibly nutritious. Myriad other products, so that the milk is coming from the seeds. But again, it's not from the leaves. The leaves, when smoked, that's where the THC and the psychoactive component comes from. So they're two very distinct worlds of products derived from the exact same plant, all of which remains under Schedule I control. But if the new the new Farm Bill passes, there might be more exceptions for growing industrial hemp. Surprisingly, Mitch McConnell is very supportive of this because he sees this as a way to revitalize neglected farming communities in his home state of Kentucky. So there's a belief that this plant can provide economic stimulus not only to people who are interested in its psychoactive components, but farmers who are struggling with products that maybe haven't been, corn, soybean, most of those commodities, the prices have been down. Like I heard on NPR today that more farmers this year are filing for bankruptcy than they have in the past 4 years. There's a lot of problems with the agricultural industry right now. So hemp and cannabis as a whole is sort of seen as potentially like the salvation of American industry as a whole. Yikes.
Yes, let's take two questions on the right side here. Either way, one of you go first.
I'm John Cloud. I really like your presentation,
Thank you.
but it was entirely focused on a national level, and I think a lot of what you call the pendulum, that other people might call dialectic, it has a whole lot to do with the fact that marijuana has never been, ever, exclusively a national issue. And the very name marijuana, gives away the game in a way, has very much to do with international commerce and culture and jazz and Latinos and African Americans in the South and the West and Mexico, and there's a whole lot to marijuana that's so far beyond just the fairly narrow parochial perspective of the Nixonites and the all of that, and that you have to include that in order to make any sense of what you call the pendulum swing.
I'm glad you asked that question. Let me perhaps sort of follow up by asking if you could talk a little bit about the international context of this. How does this compare to other countries, and to bring in the larger global story here as well, to the extent you're comfortable.
Sure. I really appreciate these questions. I think that's great. And I was actually at a conference in Scotland in April of this year on 420. I mean, it's just like the jokes write themselves. But it was called Cannabis Global Histories, where they brought together scholars from across the globe to talk about the transnational and international aspects of this history. And they are incredibly important. It is very difficult to talk about even the Nixon administration's approach to marijuana without talking about Operation Intercept in 1969, when they shut down the Mexican border for 19 days, causing a world of pain for numerous people. And the way that the drug was first introduced to the United States through, Mexican migrants who were escaping the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. This is 100%, I think, incredibly important. I did not go into it in this talk just because I was only given 45 minutes and I took 60 anyway. So I wanted to focus on this one slice of the story and to sort of add that to the larger narrative. But it's true. In particular, I think this idea of the transnational influence of it is important because the United States does set the tone so much for drug policy, particularly international drug policy, and I've received a lot of questions from journalists and things like that about how, well, if we have Canada, who is, legalized on the federal level up north, Mexico, who is essentially kind of decriminalizing below us, Uruguay, who is quite a bit lower, but, nonetheless doing that, Europe, which has, one might say, a far more enlightened approach to drug policy. Why is the United States holding on so powerfully to this, again, very anti, this drug warrior stance? These are questions that kind of go above my pay grade, I think, as far as the research that I've done. But I do agree that they're incredibly important, and we cannot isolate the history of the United States. I just wanted my book to highlight particularly the contributions that individual Americans were making to the structure of cannabis laws within this country itself.
Yep.
David Benitz. I was wondering, with marijuana as a Schedule I drug, how has medical marijuana research been done, and how is it being done now?
That's a great question. It's really hard to do it. You have to get FDA and DEA approval to get any of the federally grown marijuana that is grown on the campus of the University of Mississippi. They're the only place that has the federally organized crop. It's been around since the 1960s, 1970s. Researchers complain that the quality of it is terrible, but it's very difficult to get any other form of the drug. It's also very difficult to accept any research. Going back to the international question, we cannot accept international research on this drug either. So a lot of the medical laws are, again, building from, well, California passed it and said you could use it for anything, so maybe that's what we'll do too. But actual, real, scientifically rigorous research being done on the drug has been stymied very much by the Schedule I placement, and that is one of the most powerful arguments for reclassifying it and rescheduling it or descheduling it. It's a huge hindrance.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. David Sobelson, Washington, D.C. I have a couple of questions. One is whether you've studied polling going back to the 60s, and whether at any point in the last 50 or 60 years there's been a majority of Republicans and a majority of senior citizens also favoring legalization as there is today. And my second question is, I once was hired by John Kaplan, and I expect you're familiar with that name, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about his experience recommending marijuana decriminalization in California and getting fired from a drug committee as a result.
Oh man, good questions. The polling is really interesting. I think I'd have to go back and look a little bit more at that. One of the things that I looked into from the 1970s on were not polls about approval of, the approach to marijuana itself, but students. There's the University of Michigan's, it's called the Monitoring the Future Report, where every year they poll tens of thousands of middle schoolers and high schoolers about their views and use of drugs. And that was incredibly enlightening to sort of see what kids were using, what they admitted to using, and what their approach to drug use was. Were they in favor of it? Were they not in favor of it? And those patterns really followed the larger national gestalt about feelings of drugs at the time. To go back and look at things like Gallup polls or things like that, that would be fascinating. The article that you showed me earlier today shows that, independents, Democrats, Republicans alike, the numbers of people who support legalization are overwhelming at this point. 64 to 66% of Americans support legalization for adult use, which is fascinating and huge. And of course, the largest consumers of legalized marijuana, recreational marijuana, are seniors, are baby boomers who are using it to treat myriad health issues. That is really the kind of market at the time. So to go back and look at those polls, it's a great idea. I think I'll do that. Thank you. The Kaplan, I actually don't know too much about that. So if you would like to fill everyone in, please feel free.
Microphone.
John Kaplan wrote a book in the late 1960s called Marijuana, the New Prohibition. And he wrote that book based on his findings as a staff attorney for a commission that was established, I think, by Governor Ronald Reagan in the 1960s in California to investigate the ills and benefits of legalizing or decriminalizing marijuana. And when he came to the conclusion, as a staff attorney for this commission, that marijuana should be legalized, he was dismissed as staff attorney for the commission and published his findings in a book, Marijuana, the New Prohibition, which I think also cost me about $1.50 when I originally bought it.
That's awesome.
Kaplan, Kaplan.
Thank you. Eric?
I want to shift from marijuana, the drug, to the social movements for and against its legalization. This is one of the very rare books dealing with a polarizing issue that reads in a very even-handed way. And so even though I think we all suspect quite clearly where you stand on this issue, I suspect that those seeking to recriminalize or prevent further state-level decriminalization or legalization would not be unhappy with reading this account. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how and why you chose to approach the subject that way, how difficult it might have been, because I sense that you had to kind of restrain from critiquing. I mean, you do critique, but there's a certain gentleness in your handling. There's kind of a kid's glove quality of dealing with some of the cast of characters. And I just wonder if that was a challenge or that was something difficult and that you had to restrain your own feelings in the course of writing this to achieve that balance.
Oh, that's a great question. And thank you for saying it was even-handed, because that was a real goal of mine. As I said, I did about 24 interviews for this book, and they were 100% my favorite things to do. I loved talking to the people, oftentimes because their histories weren't fairly well known beforehand. I didn't have a lot of material to rely on, but also because it's really hard to hate people or dismiss them when you've talked to them and they've given you a cup of coffee and they're really nice, you know? I also found that there were excesses on both sides. You know, by virtue of being a grassroots group does not necessarily mean that you are essentially virtuous. There are a lot of mistakes that both sides made over and over and over again. The paraphernalia movement, by just becoming, like, you know, praying to the god of the almighty dollar, was a real problem. And I did have a certain sympathy with a lot of the parent activists, because I'm a mom myself now, and I thought, you know, I'd hate it if Henry, he's 2, haven't really had this conversation yet, but you know, but like I'd hate it if all of a sudden he was, you know, like doing something that I thought was really quite damaging to him. So as I got to know all these people as individuals and really heard their stories, and of course saw the hysteria on both sides and the way that both sides painted the other sides as these horrible, you know, animals, and oh, the parents are a bunch of Debbie Downers and the pro-legalization people want to, you know, destroy America. I thought neither of those are correct. Neither of these perspectives are right. These are just individuals who believed in something very strongly and wanted to do the best that they could. And I respected that, because again, I was thinking back to my time walking around the mall 15 years ago, or the people I know now who are so involved in social justice matters. Like, they're doing this not because they're getting paid. They often aren't, you know? They're doing it because they believe in something and they want to do their best. And that spoke to me in a very real way. And I wanted to portray that in a way where the book could be used on both sides. And I've gotten reports from some friends. I'm the editor of Points, the blog of the Alcohol and Drugs History Society. It's a lot of fun. We publish Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 10 a.m. if you want to check it out. Where they have, you know, we're all following legalization as it unrolls, and I've heard that people have been using grassroots as evidence in supporting and also really trying to work against spreading legalization laws. So I'm proud of that even-handedness, and I think that that's a very critical component of being a good historian, to not necessarily, you know, show your cards too clearly. But thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Just an anecdote to support the
Introduce yourself.
contradictory. I'm Landis Jones, a retired political scientist. But in the late 70s, I was director of the White House Fellows and took a class of fellows to Mexico, and we went to southern Mexico and witnessed the Mexican National Police in helicopters spraying bean fields, cornfields in southern Mexico, among which plants were also many marijuana plants. But then we got really ostracized by the Attorney General of Mexico, who said, and I think his term was, "You local Americans." He bawled us out in English, fortunately, and he said, "You provide us with these aircraft, you provide us with this paraquat, you encourage us to spray the marijuana, and then your senators criticize us because the parents of the American kids are afraid they will be harmed by the paraquat that's left on the marijuana."
That is amazing. God, that story is fascinating. Paraquat was such an issue in the late 1970s. It was one of the things that actually destroyed Peter Bourne's career. He was Carter's chief drug advisor and was one of the guys who was working closely with Keith Stroup and really pushing for decriminalization on a national scale. He was supportive of Mexico's use of this drug. He essentially said, you know what, we do provide them with the helicopters, we do provide them with the substance. Paraquat is an herbicide. It basically kills everything green on contact. But some plants would survive and they would continue to be trafficked across the border. And not a whole lot, but some of the drug would be contaminated with it. And Keith Stroup was incredibly fearful of this, right? Again, he's coming at it from this consumer rights angle, saying like, I should know when I'm buying and I don't want to smoke an herbicide. Reasonably so, right? So Peter Bourne says, well, marijuana does remain illegal and Mexico has the right to use this should they want to. And that was when Peter Bourne and Keith Stroup essentially, after being partners for a number of years, really broke ranks and ultimately destroyed both of their careers. There was a lot of picky, infighting and things like that. Peter Bourne may have snorted some cocaine at a NORML Christmas party in 1977. Stroup might have leaked that to the news. And then when Peter Bourne wrote a prescription for Quaaludes for his secretary in July of 1978, which were legal but were kind of known in the underground to be sex stimulants, kind of an issue. So he was prescribing Quaaludes to his secretary. He was using cocaine at NORML's Christmas party, and his career was pretty much over. He then had to resign in disgrace, all because he supported spraying of paraquat, and Keith Stroup just had his daggers out for him. So hearing that and thinking that the Mexican Attorney General is what are you saying? How can you be of these two minds about this thing is fascinating and aligns perfectly with the history I learned about this. So thank you for that insight. That's great.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Final brief question then, yeah?
I want to pick up on, David Sobelson again, I want to pick up a little bit on the reference someone made earlier about what's going on internationally. Can you talk a little bit about the experience in places like Uruguay and Portugal and contrast that a little bit with the experience now in the Philippines as to what's going on in those three countries? I mean, Uruguay and Portugal have legalized, and the Philippines now is cracking down on people who are smoking marijuana.
Sure. Yeah, it almost makes the United States seem like we're somewhere in the happy middle, right? It's that spectrum, right, of people who are going to be very accepting of the drug and people like Duterte in the Philippines who is well, if we just kill all the drug traffickers, we won't have a drug problem. That's one way to approach it, I suppose. That's incredibly, problematic. But as far as sort of the international scheme, there's always been a lot of issues. Japan also cracks down very hard on marijuana. There's a lot of countries that simply just do not accept the use of this drug. It is not, Duterte I think is the most brash about his stance because I think that sort of fits his megalomaniacal stance. But there are a lot of countries that do kind of have a very firm anti-drug, anti-marijuana approach to not only marijuana, but all drugs. But as other states are or countries, I should say, are beginning to soften their approach, that is becoming influential. Of course, the Netherlands started having coffee shops in the 1960s. They really kind of set the pace and have had, continue to have, I think, a very sort of reasonable, one might even say healthy relationship with it. So I don't think that what's happening now is that different from historical precedent, but the actual outright legalization, especially on a federal scale, is the most unprecedented aspect of it, and that may continue to have ramifications. well into the future. We'll see who else, we'll see, it's the domino theory, right? Who else will fall?
Excellent. With that, I think we'll bring this session to a close. Yes,
Thank you so much for coming. Great.
Emily certainly deserves applause for a fascinating talk and just a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. Let me remind you, next week we'll have Sarah Snyder and Nicolas Badalasi here on the history of the CSCE and the end of the Cold War. There will not be a reception this evening, since the center is hosting its annual Christmas party. Santa is visiting across the hall here, and you may have heard some kids screaming there, so apologies. I'm sure Emily will stick around for a few minutes to take any other questions you have, or point you to point you to how to purchase the book. Again, thank you. We'll see you next week, and again, Emily, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.